Hello everybody, my name is Paul DeBoer and we're here today at the Hobart PCYC to talk to Eric Abetz during the announcement of a $250,000 federal government program targeting at-risk youth in Tasmania. Hello everybody, you're here with Paul DeBoer and Senator Eric Abetz, who's generously agreed to answer some of our questions here today, both about the event that he is here to announce, his history as a politician, and some general political questions that are concerning for the Australian public at the moment. So Senator, what are you here to announce today, and how is this going to benefit the community?
Yeah, today we're announcing a very exciting grant of federal government assistance to the Hobart PCYC designed to help young people that are disengaged from society, from their family, from school, potential employment, etc. So trying to get them re-engaged, and so far Hobart PCYC has been excellent in running this program with excellent results. And as a former lawyer who was involved in the criminal justice system, I have seen what happens to young people when they are disengaged and become entangled in the criminal world and then the justice system. And if we can avoid young people that disengage from going down that track, it saves them, saves the community, and ultimately saves the taxpayer a lot of dollars. So it's a win-win-win situation, and that's why I'm always delighted to help support the Hobart PCYC, because they do such a fantastic job.
That's very good to hear. I'm sure the Tasmanian community were very appreciative of the assistance. Moving on, what do you credit for your electoral success as a senator, being re-elected 4 times?
I suppose, building on what I just said, as a lawyer, I try to look after each and every client to the very best of my ability. And then when I became a senator, I sort of do that in relation to each and every constituent. So no problem too small, no problem too big. You try and do your very best for each individual constituent. Be active, be available, and at the end of the day, the people of Tasmania have kindly rewarded me.
Very good. Would you support a state or federal government subsidised or assisted rollout of renewables and associated transmission infrastructure upgrades in Tasmania, given our unique hydro baseload power situation?
Well, very funny that you should ask about hydro, because it is the hydro that brought my family here in 1961, and I came along as a very young 3-year-old. My father got a job with the Hydroelectric Commission. With hydro, you've got renewable energy and baseload energy, which is vitally important. And so the hydro schemes in Tasmania have been superb, and that is why, if at all possible, I would like to see another interconnector between Tasmania and the mainland, and also very supportive of uplifting some of the dams that we have in Tasmania so that their capacity is increased, renewing some of the power stations so that they become more efficient, and as a result we can create more renewable energy. And given the energy supplies we have in Tasmania, hopefully we can then export some of that to the rest of Australia, of benefit to the Tasmanian community, but also to the benefit of the rest of Australia, and help us reduce emissions.
So you would like to support a link to the rest of Australia to enable us to sell more power, and an expansion to the hydro system itself. What about the addition of solar and wind capacity as cheap energy sources?
Solar, I think we still have to consider whether Tasmania is fully available for that in relation to the amount of sunshine we get, but park that one. In relation to wind power and solar, one of the real problems is they are intermittent. If the sun stops shining, you don't get energy. If the wind stops blowing, you don't get energy. With a hydro scheme and integrating those 2 sources of renewable energy with hydro works exceptionally well, because basically if the wind starts slowing down, you just turn your tap on that little bit harder and make sure more water flows out of your dam to maintain the power supply. Those that rely on coal-fired power stations, you have to keep your coal-fired power station operating at peak levels, because it takes about 24 hours to ramp up. And in those circumstances, the use of wind and solar power becomes quite difficult. But Tasmania, I think, is uniquely situated because of our hydro system to be able to integrate wind power with hydro, and we have, as I understand it, some of the most efficient wind farms in the world, and so that augurs well for Tasmania.
So would you support government assistance for the addition of wind power into the Tasmanian grid?
Well, there's been a lot of government assistance already with the hydro dams being looked at with a link across Bass Strait, and of course for wind farms and other renewables. That's been based on government demanding or requiring, I should say, a renewable energy target and providing other subsidies for people who put solar on their roof, etc. So there has already been a lot of government or public support, taxpayer support for that, and I think we've got it at about the right level.
Thank you, Senator. What is your position on Australia's housing prices, as well as the difficulty young people in particular are having entering the housing market?
Clearly there's a housing shortage in Australia, and basic economics is about supply and demand. The demand is there, the supply not so much. And the real factor that we have to deal with here is ensuring that our planning schemes allow for more housing development, for high-rise housing, for unit developments, closer housing, and that is something that local government in particular have a huge responsibility for. Because as a federal government, we have first home owner schemes, we have all sorts of schemes to encourage and help young people into their first homes, but if there's not the supply of land on which houses can be built, then it doesn't help that much. So what we need to do is free up more housing land, both broad acre developments, but also city councils have to give more consideration to high-rise developments as well, because nowadays the expensive part of buying is the actual block of land. And so if the block of land can only have one house on it, as opposed to, let's say, 4, then that block of land, the cost of that can be divided in 4 for 4 separate dwellings. Whereas if only one house is allowed on it, that one house purchaser has to bear the total cost of that block of land. So the cost of building hasn't gone up all that much until very recent times when there's now been a shortage of supply. But freeing up land is vitally important, and that is what I have been encouraging local governments to do.
So to be your position that the zoning laws are the principal way that Australia is going to ease the housing crisis?
Yes, and look, clearly as the population grows, the demand grows for housing, and what we've got to do is ensure that the stock of housing keeps pace with population growth. And look, there are other demographic and sociological factors that have been factoring in recent times.
Like a high immigration rate?
Look, high immigration rate, also family breakdown, for example. You know, if mum and dad with 3 kids were living together in one house and they separate, then for access weekends, whoever the non-custodial parent is would like to give each of those children their own bedroom in their house, and all of a sudden that which used to house one family, namely one house, requires 2 houses. And so there have been a whole host of factors that you need to consider. Can you do much about that? No, you can't, but it gives some explanation, be it immigration, be it household breakdown, etc. And nowadays, housing, the number of individual people, single people in a dwelling has increased substantially.
I do apologise, this is not on the question list, so you don't have to answer it if you want, but what is your position on, and has the government considered a land tax on the unimproved value of land to ensure that land is used more efficiently in Australia, given that you've identified that it's sort of the greatest cost, at least in general, maybe not at the moment, but the greatest cost in acquiring housing?
Look, land tax is a state government tax, not a federal government tax, so that would be up to the state to determine. But that is where the state government in Tasmania has just announced a reduction in land tax because if your residential home is land tax exempt. Every other house you might own then has a land tax applied to it. And so if you've got an investment house to rent out, if you have to pay land tax on that, what are you going to do as the owner? Increase the rent to pay for the land tax. As a result of which, a land tax is in fact not a land tax on the owner as much as on the tenant, who therefore has to pay a higher rate of rent to provide the return to the landowner. And so that is where you've got to be careful with taxation policy to ensure that you don't provide a disincentive, and if people don't invest in housing, those that can, and are then taxed for that, then of course the tenant pays. So a lot of considerations there, and ultimately what we need to do is, and as I understand it, there are plenty of landowners that want to develop their land and subdivide their land, but they're being frustrated by zoning and planning laws which don't allow them to make that land available for housing.
So I can see how the land that there would be an argument to reduce land tax because landowners pass on the costs of the tax to their renters. But wouldn't the counter argument then be that if the land tax was high enough, it wouldn't be a suitable return on investment for the investor to invest in housing? He would sell his house to the potential renter, who's then able to enter the housing market, perhaps assisted by the first homeowners grant, although I believe that's for new builds only. And then that would allow more people to completely avoid the land tax, given it's their primary residence, and then we'd have more Australians owning their own home.
Look, as a Liberal, I love the concept of home ownership, because if people actually own a stake within Australia, their own block of land with a house on it, it gives them a greater sense of ownership and participation in Australian society and the Australian body politic, because they've actually got ownership. So anything that enhances home ownership is something that I would encourage, but I think the real task is to make the land available, and once the land is made available, then you will find that there will be the growth of housing, which will bring down the cost of housing, because it's supply and demand. The greater the supply, then the lower the price in general terms, and therefore you increase housing affordability. So I like to look at practical solutions rather than taxation, so-called taxation solutions, which often have an adverse impact. So, for example, with residential investment, there is the thing called negative gearing, where you get to write off the interest against the rental income. And a previous government, a Labor government, thought that's wrong, and they changed the law. What happened? Rentals went up. Therefore, those who were on the lowest incomes had the highest impact, and within 2 years, Labor changed their own policy back to where it is now. So you have to be very careful that a good idea at the time can have adverse consequences. So you've got to think these issues through very carefully to ensure that you don't have those adverse consequences. So back to make the land available and change zoning and development application rules and bylaws to assist in the stock of housing.
So you would much prefer an increase the supply situation rather than perhaps use taxation to see the existing land used more, perhaps effectively or efficiently.
Yeah, taxation nearly always is a very blunt instrument.
And there are unintended consequences.
And then there are the unintended consequences. Whereas I think we all know about supply and demand.
Yes.
The greater supply, then the lower the price, that increases the the demand or capacity for people to buy.
I do just worry with this argument that you want to increase investment, so you create sort of tax exemptions or a favourable investment environment into Australian housing. Yes, and the problem with that is what with the growing income divide that we're having in Australia, and perhaps the international money coming into Australia, that it's...
Yeah, can I just correct you? The so-called growing divide in income...
Yes.
So, all right. The so-called growing divide is everybody is moving up. And while some are getting richer, the poor are getting richer as well. So we'll keep that in mind.
That's certainly true.
And that's the trend we want. But anyway, sorry.
But within this context, that... The more, like, if the rich get richer, then they've got more money to invest in housing, in Australian housing, and considering that housing doesn't seem to be keeping up with demand, that the production isn't following demand, those increased dollars chasing the existing amount of properties is driving up housing prices, and I just worry that making Australian housing a very attractive investment, especially in existing stock and not building new houses, that will create a nation of renters. Where we've got perhaps a very, very wealthy group that have a lot of money to invest in the inflated housing market, but.
Look, just a few quick statistics, if I may.
Yes.
80% of the housing stock where they are investment houses, it's only one house that, let's say, your local policeman, teacher, or people on middle incomes that want to prepare for their future and their retirement. So the vast stock of investment housing is in fact in the hands of individual Australians that just have the one or possibly two houses. So that is the one factor. The other factor is that for every single business in Australia, and quite rightly so, we allow tax deduction for the loan which allows you to earn that income. So if you invest in a sandwich shop, for example, and you buy it, and you then borrow, let's say, easy figures, it costs 100,000, you borrow 80,000, then the interest on the 80,000 is deductible from the income you get from your sandwich shop. The same with a farm, the same with any manufacturing enterprise. The borrowings you have to start the business or make the business, the interest is tax deductible. And so to say housing, all of a sudden if you invest in a house for your business purposes, changing the taxation regime just for that will again distort the market, because then all of a sudden investment in housing will no longer be seen as a potential business investment. And I think it's good to see individual Australians seeking to better themselves by investing, but what we need to do again, as I say, increase the supply, and then that will factor in the sort of outcomes that both you and I clearly want. Yeah.
So you would argue that residential properties aren't particularly protected as an investment class, privileged as an investment class in Australia.
No, they aren't. It's the same sort of business model that the Taxation Office uses for any other business model. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. One more question, if you still can.
Yep.
Are you worried about the impact rising interest rates will have on the economy, considering Australian households have the 5th highest rates of household indebtedness in the OECD?
Yeah, look, clearly interest rate rises are going to come. They're at historic lows, and when interest rates rise, there are consequences. Those that have got money in the bank like it because they get a higher return on their investment in the bank. Those that have borrowed from the bank have to pay more, and so there will be consequences, and that is why people of a conservative disposition like myself always say be very careful in how much you borrow and putting away some money for a rainy day, etc. So conservative approaches to your borrowings has always been good common sense, because you can never rely on historically low interest rates keeping on for 10 or 20 years. And I am concerned about what will happen, and I just hope and trust that banks have been sufficiently cautious to ensure that they don't allow their clients to become burdened by an interest rate increase that they clearly won't be able to afford.
Thank you so much for your time. It was great to talk to you.
A pleasure.
I've read so much about you.
Good. No, pleasure. And good to talk and
Thank
good
you.
to meet, and hope it goes well. Good.